The first thing you smell is ammonia. That's because your day begins with a chamber pot, not the queen's. Don't flatter yourself. You're not nearly that important. This one belongs to her lady-in-waiting, and it's your job to scrub it until the palace no longer reeks like an open sewer. On your knees, cold stone biting through your skin, you wipe away what history books politely leave out. Above you, chandeliers glimmer, fine china waits for breakfast, and gowns worth more than your entire life hang ready for their moment. Down here, your ash, sweat, and silence. And yet, without you, the stockings don't get laundered. The pheasant never makes it to the royal table, and the glittering show of monarchy collapses before it even begins. Congratulations. You're invisible, but indispensable. Before we step into the world of Victorian palace service tonight, a quick note. If you'd like to listen to these stories without ads, offline, and with a bonus insider episode, you can find the ad-free collection linked in the description and pinned comment. So settle in, breathe slowly, and let's walk the narrow corridors of palace life together. But first, if you're listening without subscribing, think of yourself as one of these forgotten servants, faceless, erased from memory. That's what you are to the algorithm. Rebel against obscurity. Subscribe. And tell me, what time is it where you are right now? You are not alone down here. In fact, you are one of an army, thousands strong. And yet, you feel alone, because the job of a servant in a Victorian palace was to exist in the shadows. Historians like to write about kings, queens, and ministers, the names etched into marble. But they rarely write about you, the person scrubbing boots, hauling coal, or brushing lint from a velvet jacket. That doesn't mean you weren't important. Without you, the palace doesn't function. Without you, the illusion of royal splendor collapses before it ever reaches the dining room. And what an illusion it was. Imagine the scene upstairs. Silk gowns rustling, chandeliers burning bright with hundreds of beeswax candles, carriages arriving in a parade of wealth. And now, imagine the machinery beneath it. That machinery is you. It is the bell that rings you awake at 5 a.m., the endless corridors where you shuffle trays, the laundry that never dries fast enough in England's damp weather. The Victorian Palace was essentially a luxury hotel run by a hidden workforce, and you are on the bottom rung of that ladder. How many servants did it take to keep a royal palace running? Well, at its height, Buckingham Palace alone employed over 1,000. Yes, 1,000. That's a small town, devoted entirely to dusting, scrubbing, laundering, cooking, polishing, carrying, waiting, and, when required, standing perfectly still in livery to look decorative. It wasn't just the obvious roles like footmen and maids. The staff list could read like a strange fairy tale. Rat catchers, ice keepers, mole takers, confectioners, and even a man employed solely to wind the palace clocks. Imagine dedicating your entire career to making sure the royal clocks ticked on time. And if you're thinking, well, that sounds easy. Remember, this was Victorian Britain. There were over 400 clocks in the palace. You'd have to live by the chime, moving from room to room, key in hand, making sure the illusion of royal punctuality was never broken. Above all of this grandeur sat the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Steward, and the Master of the Horse. Men of noble birth who oversaw vast departments as though they were running kingdoms within kingdoms. But you don't report to them. You're too far down the ladder for that. You take orders from the butler, or maybe the housekeeper, who takes orders from someone else, who takes orders from someone else, until, like magic, Your backbreaking work results in the queen's soup being warm enough and her gloves being clean enough. This invisible chain of command was rigid. A scullery maid knew her place, just as the master cook knew his. To step outside of it was social suicide. Even among servants, there was a pecking order sharp enough to cut glass. Footmen sneered at kitchen boys. Maids looked down on scullions. And yet, when summoned by the bell, you all ran the same. Ah, yes, the bells. Picture it. A long board hung with dozens of wires, each connected to a different room. When a royal finger tugged the cord upstairs, a bell would jangle downstairs, and one of you, whoever was closest, would sprint to obey. Every clang meant a new command. Polish the silver, fetch the coal, prepare the bath water, lace the corset, light the fire, carry the letter, or, yes, scrub the chamber pot. You did not decide when to move, eat, or even breathe freely. The bells ruled your life. And here's the part you'll love. You weren't supposed to be seen unless absolutely necessary. The goal was invisibility. If a royal walked into a room, you slipped out. If they rang the bell, you appeared silently, did your duty, and vanished like smoke. The Victorian palace wanted to run as if by magic, and you were the magic trick, present but never acknowledged. You might be thinking, well, at least the pay made it worthwhile. No, the pay was meager, sometimes laughable, barely enough to keep body and soul together. A footman might earn $20-40 a year, which sounds like a fortune until you realize he had to buy his own uniform out of it. A scullery maid earned even less, and she didn't get the benefit of livery or tips from noble guests. You worked for prestige, not prosperity. The kind of prestige that meant your mother could brag that her daughter polished spoons in a palace while you coughed yourself to death in the laundry steam. And the hours, dawn to dusk, sometimes longer. Servants lived in a world where time wasn't measured in hours, but in tasks. Light the fires, blacken the grates, boil the water, press the sheets, serve the supper, clean it all up, collapse, and do it again tomorrow. There was no such thing as a day off. Even Sundays were filled with duties, plus the expectation of chapel attendance, because nothing says rest like hauling yourself into church after 14 hours of labor. What kept people here then? For some, it was survival. For others, it was the tiny chance that loyal service might open doors. A valet might follow his master abroad. A lady's maid might inherit dresses too fine for her station. A footman might one day climb the servant hierarchy. And yes, some even married up into better positions or occasionally caught the eye of nobility. But those were exceptions, not rules. For most of you, the palace was both workplace and prison. Here's the irony. Upstairs, guests spoke endlessly of grandeur, luxury, and refinement. But behind every glimmer of gold leaf was an army of tired bodies, yours included. Your life was calluses and coal dust, while upstairs they debated the proper angle of a soup spoon. And this is the invisible army you've just joined. Nobody sees you. Nobody thanks you. Yet every fork wiped, every candle lit, every polished boot is yours. You'd think a monarch could wipe their own fork, but no, that's your job. So get used to the sound of the bell. It doesn't care if you're hungry. It doesn't care if you're tired. It doesn't care if your hands are raw. It only cares that the show must go on. And you, whether you like it or not, are the one keeping the curtain from falling. The palace is asleep. Chandeliers are dark, velvet curtains drawn, and the grand halls echo with silence. But you don't get silence. You get the scrape of boots on stone and the rattle of coal buckets in the dark. 5 o'clock in the morning is when your workday begins. The royals are still dreaming, tucked into feather mattresses. You, on the other hand, are stumbling out of a drafty attic room or a narrow cot in the servants' quarters, where the mattress is little more than a sack of straw. If you're lucky, you slept at all. Your shift yesterday may have ended past midnight. The first task? Fires, always the fires. The palace may look like a glittering jewel box from the outside, but it's also a drafty brick refrigerator. Every single hearth, grate, and stove must be lit before anyone upstairs dares emerge from their rooms. That means hauling coal up staircases that seem endless, balancing heavy scuttles against your chest as dust chokes your lungs. Your hands ache, your shoulders burn, and all you've done so far is make sure someone else's toes won't get cold. Of course, you're not alone in this misery. The scullery boy is already awake, sleeves rolled up, elbows deep in greasy pans that never seem to come clean. Kitchen maids are bent over chopping blocks, knives flashing in the flicker of oil lamps. They'll spend the entire day peeling, chopping, boiling, and scrubbing, only to collapse hours later smelling of onions and ash. And then there's you, stumbling upstairs with your coal buckets, praying you don't spill a single piece, because wasted coal means wasted wages. Forget about breakfast. If you manage to sneak a crust of stale bread before your next task, count yourself lucky. Tea? Not for you. That steaming pot of tea is reserved for upstairs. You'll sip weak, reused leaves if anything at all. This is not the kind of breakfast in the palace you might have imagined when you first dreamed of royal service. By now, the bellboard is twitching. You hear it jangle, then again, then again. Each pull of a cord upstairs means another demand downstairs. Someone wants hot water. Someone else wants their boots blacked. And of course, the kitchen already needs more coal for the stoves. You don't run the palace. You're simply fuel for it, just like the coal you carry. Imagine this routine stretched across dozens of servants. Chambermaids carrying jugs of water, hall boys sweeping staircases, housemaids stripping beds and beating dust from carpets. Each of them moves like clockwork, trained not to be noticed. To the royal family, beds are magically made, fires magically lit, food magically ready. But you know the truth. This is no magic. This is 5 a.m. drudgery powered by sore backs and empty stomachs. There's no glamour in these early hours. You work in silence, because conversation wastes time and noise risks notice. Your uniform is plain, your apron stiff with starch, your shoes worn thin from climbing. And yet, invisibility is part of the job description. If a royal happens to rise early and catch sight of you, it's considered a failure. You're meant to vanish into walls, a shadow that tidies and cleans but never breathes too loudly. Some historians call this the hidden machinery of the palace. That's generous. It feels less like machinery and more like servitude disguised as duty. You light fire after fire, carry bucket after bucket, scrub pan after pan. And just when you think you've finished, a bell rings again. There's always another fire to light, another coal scuttle to haul. And remember, this is just the beginning of your day. The royals haven't even stirred yet. When they finally rise, the real parade of demands will begin. Dressing gowns, breakfasts, newspaper deliveries, fresh linens, carriages prepared. If you're tired now, too bad. You still have 14 hours to go. Do you ever stop and think while lugging that bucket how ridiculous this all is? Hundreds of able-bodied men and women rising in the dark so that one family doesn't have to feel the chill of a stone floor under their toes. You'd think a monarch could at least light their own fire. But no, that's your job. So you push on. You push on because the palace demands it, because the bells won't stop ringing, because bread crusts, coal dust, and the aching rhythm of work have become your life. 5 a.m. is only the start. The palace is alive now, not with the sound of royalty, not yet, but with the clanging, ceaseless chatter of bells. If you thought church bells were holy, wait until you meet the true gods of your life, the bellboard. You've seen it, haven't you? A long wooden frame hung on the wall in the servants' hall, wires trailing like veins through the plaster, each ending in a little metal bell. Upstairs, every room has its cord. Tug the cord, and down here a bell jumps, clinks, and vibrates. And when it moves, you move. No questions, no delays. The bell rings, and your body obeys. To you, the bellboard is less a piece of wood and more a dictator. It rules your day, your meals, your sleep, even your thoughts. You don't decide when to walk across the corridor. The bell does. You don't decide when to set down the tray or lace the boot. The bell does. If a royal so much as sneezes, chances are a bell rings to summon you with a handkerchief. It's a strange orchestra. One bell might sound like a sharp little chirp, another like a lazy jangle. After a while, you learn to recognize them without looking. Ah, that's the yellow drawing room, you think. Or, that's the prince's dressing chamber. You hear them even in your dreams. Sometimes, when no bell is ringing at all, you swear you still hear the faint metallic echo. Now imagine this. Dozens of bells jangling in quick succession. Upstairs, the family prepares for breakfast. One wants hot water, another wants a newspaper fetched, another decides their boots aren't shiny enough. The board shivers like a nervous animal, bells bouncing, wires trembling, as if the palace itself is demanding your obedience. So you run. You all run. A housemaid scurries up the back stairs with fresh linens. A footman strides down the corridor balancing a silver tray. A scullery maid nearly drops a jug of steaming water as she darts past. Nobody collides because everyone knows their place. It's a dance of invisibility, timed perfectly to the bells. Of course, the real trick of the bell system is that you're never meant to be seen unless summoned. You're supposed to appear out of nowhere, fulfill the command, and vanish again. If the queen tugs her cord, you materialize like a ghost, smooth her dress, and slip back into the shadows. If a guest rings, you bow, deliver what they want, and evaporate. You are not a person with aches and thoughts. You are the human extension of a bell. And here's the comedy of it all. The royals didn't even have to speak. The entire hierarchy of command could be managed by a tiny flick of a wrist. Ring a bell, and down you come like Pavlov's dog. Your life is basically one long game of hide and seek, except you never hide, and they never seek. They just ring. There were rules, of course. If the king's bell rang, it took priority over everyone else's. If 2 bells rang at once, the higher servant in rank responded first. And heaven help you if you answered a bell too slowly. There was no quicker way to find yourself scolded, demoted, or dismissed than to let a bell jangle unanswered for more than a minute. Now picture the sensory storm. The clangs echo through the servants' hall, bouncing off stone walls. Somewhere above, footsteps creak. Below, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of plates, the hiss of kettles, and always, always the bells. It's a world that never sits still. The irony? The bells were installed to make the palace run more smoothly, to bring order to chaos. But for you, they brought only more chaos. A single morning might see you run from the scullery to the grand staircase half a dozen times. The system was efficient for them, not for you. For you, it was exhaustion disguised as duty. Some servants hated the bells with a passion. Others learned to live by them. A few even found humor in it, joking that one day they'd answer a bell with nothing more than a mirror, so the royals could see just how ridiculous they looked, summoning human beings as if they were mechanical toys. But you don't dare joke. You just run. Your hands are blistered from carrying coal, your apron is damp with sweat, and your stomach growls with hunger. The bells don't care. The bells never care. They only care that the palace remains spotless, seamless, perfect. And so you live by the bellboard. Its little wires connect you to every corner of the palace, tying your body to the whims of people who will never know your name. You can forget breakfast, forget sleep, forget any notion of free will. Because when the bell rings, you belong to someone else. So remember this. In the Victorian palace, you are not in charge of your own time. The bell is. It's the first sound you hear in the morning, and often the last sound at night. And tomorrow, when you drag yourself out of bed at 5 a.m. again, you'll do it all over, waiting for the first clang to tell you where to go and what to do. The palace may dazzle the world above, but below it's nothing more than a dictatorship of bells. Upstairs, there are silks, satins, lace, and pearls. Downstairs, there is you, tied into an apron that smells faintly of starch and yesterday's sweat. That is the great divide of palace life. Finery at the top, plainness at the bottom. You might think uniforms were designed to make servants look respectable. Wrong. They were designed to make you identifiable and invisible at the same time. You wear livery that marks you out as staff, so no guest ever mistakes you for one of them, but also plain enough to fade into the wallpaper when not needed. You are decorative when summoned, but otherwise you're scenery. Your apron is not stitched from satin or embroidered with gold. It's coarse linen, bleached until stiff, tied around your waist like a reminder that you are here to work. And yet, even this simple garment had rules. Aprons had to be spotless. Wrinkled aprons meant punishment. Stained aprons meant disgrace. You might spend your morning scrubbing chamber pots or hauling ash, but heaven forbid the Queen's butler catches you with a dirty tie at your waist. Contrast this with upstairs, where debates about diamonds could consume an afternoon. Should the Queen wear the tiara with emeralds or the one with sapphires? Should the gown be trimmed with lace or with ermine? Your apron smells of starch and sweat, while above you, someone is agonizing over which jewel best reflects imperial authority. At least your choices are simple. Wear the apron or lose your job. Now there were roles where uniforms did edge toward the spectacular. Footmen in particular were dressed like ornamental furniture. Gold-braided coats, powdered wigs, buckled shoes. They were supposed to impress visiting guests, to stand like shiny tin soldiers at the edge of the royal dining room. But don't be fooled. The footman might look dazzling in crimson velvet, but his pockets were still empty. The uniform belonged to the palace, not to him, and he paid for it out of his wages. His livery wasn't a privilege, it was a financial trap. Compare that to women's roles, especially dressers and laundresses. One of the most famous was Mrs. Thielke, dresser to Queen Charlotte. She lived her life surrounded by finery, but never wore it herself. She handed gowns to the Queen in the correct order, powdered her wigs, pinned her lace, and quietly stood in the background while the monarch transformed into a walking symbol of empire. Without Mrs. Thielke, the queen would have struggled to dress herself. Yet Mrs. Thielke wore little more than a serviceable gown, a modest cap, and yes, the eternal apron. And that apron carried its own weight of symbolism. It wasn't just cloth. It was a barrier between you and them, between service and status. No matter how close you stood to the queen, no matter if your hands touched the very lace that brushed the royal skin, the apron marked you as different, separate, beneath. Of course, aprons were practical too. They caught spills, soot, flour, grease, and dust, all of which clung to you like shadows of the work you did. If you worked in the laundry, it reeked of soap and steam. If you worked in the kitchen, it smelled of roasting meat and onion skins. If you worked as a housemaid, it carried the faint scent of polish and ashes. The apron was a diary of your labor, written in stains. And then there were corsets. Thankfully, servants didn't have to endure whalebone structures cinched so tightly they left bruises on the ribs. You didn't have time for that nonsense. You needed to move, bend, scrub, and carry. At least aprons don't need whalebone corsets. Small mercies. Still, you did have to lace yourself into stiff stays or bodices, tight enough to look presentable, loose enough not to faint while hauling water. Uniforms weren't just clothing. They were tools of discipline. A wrinkled cuff or crooked cap could draw the ire of the housekeeper or butler. Appear sloppy, and you might be accused of laziness. Appear too fine, and you might be accused of vanity. Servants lived in a strange middle space, always neat, never flashy, always clean, never comfortable. Meanwhile, upstairs, gowns told stories of wealth and status. Queen Charlotte's dresses alone could take hours to assemble, with layers of lace, whalebone, and embroidery stitched with her initials. Every inch of fabric screamed power, and yet, behind each dress was an army of invisible hands, seamstresses, laundresses, and dressers like Mrs. Thielke, whose labor held the empire together one button at a time. Think about the absurdity for a moment. Upstairs, one woman fusses over the sparkle of her tiara. Downstairs, another woman, perhaps you, is scrubbing that woman's apron because a smudge of soot landed on it during the morning fire lighting. Both tasks are treated with the same urgency. One is about diamonds, the other is about dirt. Both, apparently, are crucial to the palace. So when you tie on your apron in the morning, remember this: you're not just protecting your dress from grime. You're tying on your identity, your place in the invisible order of the palace. You're announcing to the world, I am here to serve, to carry, to clean, and to vanish when the bell rings. And yet, for all its starch and sweat, the apron was oddly liberating compared to the cages of silk upstairs. While the queen was stitched into a gown she could barely sit down in, you could at least bend your knees. While a maid of honor floated around in a whalebone skirt, unable to cross her arms, you had freedom of movement, even if it meant freedom only to scrub another floor. So yes, your apron might never sparkle in candlelight. It might never command the gaze of foreign ambassadors. But it was honest. It told the truth. It said, this is work, not theater. And in a palace where appearances ruled, that truth was rare. And if you're still listening without subscribing, well then you're treating this channel the same way the royals treated their servants, invisible until needed, forgotten the moment you vanish. Don't be that cruel. Subscribe. If you thought lighting fires and carrying coal was hard, wait until you meet the true tyrant of palace life, the laundry. Forget the romantic image of gowns rustling elegantly down marble staircases. Each of those gowns was a maintenance nightmare. Silk that had to be brushed, lace that had to be hand-washed, velvet that couldn't be folded for fear of creasing. And who kept it all immaculate? Not the queen, not the ladies in waiting. It was you, or more precisely, the battalion of laundresses boiling, scrubbing, starching, and ironing from dawn until their backs gave out. Step into the laundry room with me. It is not glamorous. It is hot, damp, and suffocating. The air is thick with steam from copper tubs bubbling over wood fires. The smell? A mix of wet linen, lye soap, and sweat. You can hardly breathe, and yet the room never rests. There are piles of linens, heaps of gowns, stacks of shirts, and under it all, the endless drip of dirty water splashing against stone. You bend over a tub, your arms plunged into boiling water. Ash and lye sting your skin until it cracks. You scrub, wring, rinse, and repeat, day after day. The queen's handkerchiefs, the king's stockings, the maid's caps, each one must be perfectly white, perfectly clean, perfectly ironed. No wrinkles, no stains, no excuses. Forget perfume. The queen smells of the labor of 12 laundresses boiling water for hours. Every drop of lavender water sprinkled on her gowns is only masking the stench of endless scalding tubs below stairs. And don't imagine for a moment that this was just laundry. This was backbreaking science. To keep lace stiff, you had to soak it in starch made from wheat or potatoes, then press it flat with irons heated in the fire. Those irons were heavy, solid hunks of metal. If you set them down for even a moment, soot would smear the fabric. If you pressed too hard, the cloth scorched. The margin between success and disaster was a single heartbeat. Consider the royal sheets. Every week they had to be stripped, boiled, bleached, and stretched on great wooden frames. The sheets of Buckingham Palace could fill a barn. Each one took hours to scrub by hand, and by the time you'd finished, another pile had arrived. It was a task without end. And while you worked, you sweated in layers of coarse clothing. The steam clung to your apron until it was soaked through. Your hair frizzed in the damp heat, your skin puckered from water, and your lungs wheezed from smoke curling off the fires. Some laundresses died young, not from laziness, but from lungs ruined by years of inhaling ash and chemical fumes. The hierarchy reached even here. The head laundress earned a decent salary and had a respectable allowance for soap, starch, and alum. But beneath her was an army of women, casual laborers who came and went, often working for pennies, hauling wet cloth heavier than a grown man. They didn't get a salary. They got blisters, coughs, and if they were lucky, a stale crust of bread. Ironically, laundry had prestige. To be trusted with the monarch's clothing meant you were close to the body, if not the person. The laundress handled garments worn directly against the skin, washed sheets that bore the royal imprint, and kept them immaculate. It was invisible intimacy. Yet the laundress herself was never acknowledged. You might clean a chemise that touched the queen's flesh, but you would never once be permitted to look her in the eye. And still, the work never ended. In winter, you had to find ways to dry clothes in damp air. In summer, you battled flies and mildew. Rain ruined drying days. Fires burned out. Soap was expensive, starch temperamental. And yet, when the queen emerged in a gown stiff with lace and fresh as morning frost, everyone admired her elegance. Nobody thought of you, red-eyed, steam-burned, standing knee-deep in soapy water. There's a kind of cruel poetry to it. Upstairs, the royals lived in satin dreams. Downstairs, you lived in steam nightmares. Their appearance depended entirely on your exhaustion. They looked immaculate because you looked like ruin. And of course, your day didn't end when the laundry was hung and pressed. By the time you dragged yourself back to your cot, your hands raw and your body aching, the bell might ring again. Another gown stained, another shirt dirtied, another urgent wash demanded. For you, clean never lasted long. Dirt was always waiting. So when you imagine palace life, don't picture only the gleam of jewels or the flutter of lace. Picture the sweat dripping into a boiling tub. Picture the hiss of a hot iron pressed into linen. Picture your apron soaked through with steam and your lungs stinging with smoke. That was the reality beneath the glamour. The palace may have sparkled above, but below it reeked of soap and misery. Step carefully now. The laundry was hot, but the kitchens? The kitchens are hell. Not metaphorical hell, literal, choking, smoky, sweat-soaked hell. The palace kitchens were the beating heart of royal life, and they never stopped. Dawn till past midnight, fires roared in great brick hearths, spits turned endlessly, and knives never rested. The smell alone was overwhelming. Roasting meat, boiling soups, burning fat, spilled ale, and smoke so thick it coated your throat. You stand there, apron already damp, shoulders aching as you grip the long handle of a spit. On it, a haunch of venison slowly turns, juices dripping into the flames. Your face sweats from the ovens, your back aches from turning spits of meat you'll never taste, and your stomach growls at the irony. The feast is inches from your nose, but your supper will be scraps at best. Above you, the royals expect nothing less than perfection. A single hair in a dish? Disaster. A soup too salty? Humiliation. Meanwhile, downstairs, you've already sliced your finger once, burned your wrist twice, and spilled hot grease onto your shoes. No one cares. Injuries are part of the job. Bandage it quickly, keep working, or risk dismissal. The scale of it all is staggering. Think of Christmas dinner at your own table. Turkey, stuffing, maybe a pie. Now multiply that by 70. A royal banquet might require 70 dishes per course, all laid out at once. Dishes of fish, roasted birds, jellied meats, puddings, pies, custards, and ices, arranged not just for taste but for spectacle. And you are one of the invisible hands making it all appear. The master cook oversees the chaos, bellowing instructions over the roar of fire and clang of pans. Under him, armies of assistants chop, peel, stir, and roast. Scullery maids scrub pans blackened with grease. Kitchen boys lug buckets of water and baskets of ingredients. Pastry cooks roll dough until their arms ache. Each person has a role, each role a hierarchy, and at the bottom, you. You spend hours chopping onions, your eyes stinging until tears run down your cheeks. You haul sacks of flour heavy enough to crush you if you stumble. You fetch wood for the fire, water for the pots, and pans so hot they sear your fingertips. You live in a constant rhythm of exhaustion. One dish done, another begins. And for what? Meanwhile, upstairs, someone complains their pheasant is slightly dry. Imagine roasting dozens of birds in a smoke-filled inferno and then hearing that the queen frowned because her meat wasn't moist enough. That's palace life. There is no glamour here, only sweat and misery. The air is thick, the noise relentless, the hours unending. You eat standing up, if you eat at all. A crust of bread, a stolen bite of cheese, perhaps a spoonful of stew, whatever you can sneak when no one is watching. Your hands smell of garlic, grease, and soot. Your clothes reek of smoke. And still, you must bow your head when the butler arrives, demanding another tray to be carried upstairs. The irony, of course, is that the royals believed this food was effortless, magically conjured. They sat at tables laden with silver dishes, sipping wine and gossiping, never once considering the burned, blistered hands that had prepared their feast. The illusion of ease was the product of your exhaustion. And yet, the kitchen was not only misery, it was also invention. Cooks experimented constantly, borrowing French techniques, adding German flavors, dabbling in Italian pasta. The Notebook of William Daniel, a master cook of the 18th century, shows dishes as familiar as macaroni and cheese, and as bizarre as boiled turtle. You might be standing over a pot one day and realize you're helping to create dishes that would travel the world. Not that you'll be remembered for it. The hierarchy extended even here. The master cook had respect, the pastry chef had skill, but the scullery maid? Invisible. She worked in the filthiest corner of the kitchen, scrubbing pans until her hands cracked, surrounded by water black with grease. She was the lowest of the low, but without her, nothing functioned. That's the cruel paradox of service. The least respected were often the most essential. You wipe sweat from your brow. Another pot boils over. Another spit needs turning. The day stretches endlessly, and still the dishes keep coming. You wonder how many meals you've helped prepare in your life. Hundreds? Thousands? And yet not once have you sat at that upstairs table. Not once have you tasted the food you toiled over. This is the kitchen inferno. No chandeliers, no silk, no applause. Just smoke, knives, and endless work. And when the guests leave and the plates come back down, you'll still be here, scrubbing, scraping, sweating. The palace may sparkle above, but below it burns. The palace kitchens are roaring, and you've been sweating over spits, stew pots, and pans all day. But now comes the real performance, the banquet. Forget your family suppers of a roast and maybe a pudding. A Victorian banquet was something else entirely, an exercise in absurd excess. 70 dishes per course was not unusual. Let me repeat that, 70. Imagine filling a table so heavily that the wood groans, then doing it all over again 2 more times before dessert. You carry the platters up one by one, balancing silver dishes so polished they nearly blind you under candlelight. Every step is watched, every movement rehearsed. No clatter, no stumble, no spilled sauce. Upstairs, the dining room glows with chandeliers and mirrors, amplifying every sparkle of glass and every glint of silver. Guests murmur politely, pretending they aren't impressed, even as their eyes widen at the sheer scale of food. And what food? There are pies shaped like castles, puddings trembling like towers, jellies that quiver in the light, platters of jellied tongue, turtle soup steaming rich and oily, even roasted puffins shipped from the far north. Yes, puffins, those cute little birds with colorful beaks. On the royal menu, they weren't mascots, they were meat. You arrange them carefully, because presentation matters more than your back pain. The feast is served in the French style à la française, which means everything for one course is laid on the table at once. A dazzling buffet designed to overwhelm the senses. The first course might bring great roasts, venison, pheasants, whole salmon gleaming with sauce. The second course lightens things only slightly, perhaps delicately dressed vegetables, pies filled with game, custards, and soufflés. And finally, dessert, the so-called sweet course, which could include iced creams, sugared fruits, and elaborate cakes sculpted to impress. Your role in all of this? To make sure it appears seamless, to whisk trays in and out like clockwork, to refill goblets before they're empty, to anticipate every twitch of a royal eyebrow that might suggest hunger. Meanwhile, the guests pick delicately at their plates, a fork here, a nibble there. No one wants to appear greedy, and no one could possibly eat 70 dishes in one sitting. But that's not the point. The point is the theater of it, the spectacle. The table is a stage, the food the scenery, and the royals the stars of the show. You're the stagehand, invisible, making sure the curtain never falls. And after all this labor, what do you eat? Not the venison, not the pheasant, not the turtle soup. If you're lucky, you might get the scraps. What's scraped off platters once they return downstairs. Maybe a sliver of meat, maybe a crust of pie, maybe the bones gnawed clean by someone who barely noticed the effort that went into preparing it. Congratulations, you've eaten royal leftovers. The irony burns worse than the ovens. You've worked yourself raw producing dishes fit for emperors, but your stomach is lined with scraps and crusts, bread hardened at the edges, a slice of cold pudding, the heel of a loaf nobody upstairs wanted. This is the diet of the invisible army, and yet even scraps have their politics. Higher-ranking servants, like the butler, footman, or housekeeper, claimed the choicest leftovers. They dined on decent meat, cheeses, and pastries. The rest filtered down the chain until scullery maids and hallboys scraped bowls clean of broth. The very structure of the banquet extended into the servant hierarchy. Even your leftovers had a pecking order. Still, scraps were better than nothing. They were fuel for another day of drudgery, and in some rare cases, they were small luxuries, a taste of a dish you'd never otherwise afford. You might chew on a piece of roasted partridge and think, briefly, so this is how the other half lives. And then the bell rings, and you're back to work. Remember, too, that not all dishes were familiar. Exotic imports were prized. Pineapples, oranges, sugar, and spices, shipped from the farthest corners of empire. They weren't just food, they were symbols of imperial power. A pineapple placed on the table was as much a statement of dominance as a jewel in a crown. And you, hauling it in, knew it represented wealth you'd never touch. By the end of the banquet, you're staggering. The trays feel heavier, the air hotter, the noise louder. Upstairs, the royals lean back in chairs, sipping wine and complaining about their digestion. Downstairs, you scrub grease from silver, mop spills from floors, and scrape bones into buckets. The feast that dazzled upstairs becomes filth below, and yet tomorrow it happens all over again. Another banquet, another 70 dishes, another night of spectacle. The palace eats, and you suffer. The palace shines, and you sweat. This is the theater of monarchy, splendor above, exhaustion below. And while they nibble delicately on puffins and puddings, you gnaw on bread crusts in the shadows, hoping the scraps will be enough to keep you standing for another day. You might think all servants were equal, one big invisible team, united in misery. Wrong. Even below stairs, rank ruled everything. The palace was not just divided between royals and servants. It was divided again into layers of servants judging each other, glaring at each other, and desperately clinging to whatever shred of superiority their position gave them. So let's start at the top. The butler. He was king of the downstairs world, ruler of wine cellars and silverware, master of the dining room. When he strode through the servants' hall, everyone else straightened up. He didn't scrub or carry. Oh no, he issued orders. And yet, remember, he was still a servant. He might sneer at you as though he owned the palace, but in truth, he was polishing someone else's forks. The butler sneers at you, but he's still a servant himself, just a servant with fancier buttons. Then came the housekeeper, formidable, watchful, and feared. She oversaw the female staff, keeping track of who polished the floors, who lit the fires, and who dared leave smudges on the banisters. Her keys rattled like chains of command, every ring on her belt a reminder of her power. And while she was technically below the royals, to you, she might as well have been queen. Below them were the footmen, tall, good-looking, chosen for their appearance as much as their skill. They wore fine livery trimmed with gold braid, stood beside carriages, opened doors, and served at table with elegance. Guests whispered about their height and their posture as though they were decorative statues come to life. And yet, despite their glamour, they earned less than you might think. They paid for their uniforms out of their wages, and many ended their careers crippled from standing motionless for hours. Still, they looked down on kitchen maids as though being ornamental were an achievement. Valets and ladies' maids occupied another strange tier. They were personal servants, attending only one master or mistress, managing wardrobes, grooming, and private tasks. Valets knew which buttons needed polishing, which boots needed buffing, and which secrets needed silence. Ladies' maids pinned hair, tied corsets, and soothed tempers. They lived close to their employers, often sleeping just outside their doors. This intimacy gave them a peculiar power. They were low-born, but they held noble reputations in their hands. A misplaced word from a valet could sink a gentleman's dignity. A complaint from a lady's maid could expose a scandal. That proximity was both privilege and prison. Then came the cooks. The head cook commanded respect, especially in the palace kitchens, where meals were spectacles of imperial pride. A successful cook could earn influence, and sometimes even a legacy, recipes bearing their names, dishes carried across the empire. But below the head cook were armies of undercooks, pastry cooks, and scullery workers, each chained to their tasks. Peel potatoes, knead dough, scrub pans. Repeat. The lower you went, the dirtier the work. And at the very bottom, scraping the last crumbs of status, were the scullery maids and hall boys. They scrubbed pots blackened with grease, cleaned boots soiled from the streets, emptied chamber pots, and swept endless corridors. No one envied their jobs. They were seen as replaceable, disposable, children of poverty with little chance of climbing higher. If you were unlucky enough to be here, congratulations. You were at the lowest rung of the ladder, the shadow beneath shadows. But even this shadow had rules. You had to know your place. A scullery maid did not speak to a footman unless spoken to. A hall boy did not address the butler directly unless delivering a message. The hierarchy was invisible but strict, enforced by glares, reprimands, and the occasional public humiliation. The irony, of course, is that none of it really mattered to the royals upstairs. To them, you were all the same. But downstairs, these lines were everything. They determined who ate first when scraps were shared, who sat where at the servants' table, and who got scolded when something went wrong. Imagine the absurdity. You all work in misery, your backs breaking in unison, but you still find ways to look down on each other. The footman mocks the scullery boy. The scullery boy resents the hall maid. The cook dismisses the laundress, its human nature twisted into a hierarchy of exhaustion. And yet, there was ambition even here. A hall boy could dream of becoming a footman. A kitchen maid might rise to assistant cook. A clever lady's maid could marry well, or at least marry better than her mother. The palace was not just a workplace. It was a ladder. Most never climbed it, but the possibility dangled just enough hope to keep everyone in line. So where does that leave you? Somewhere near the bottom, most likely. Running when bells ring, sweating in the kitchens, polishing boots you'll never wear. You look up the ladder and see only more labor, only with fancier clothes and slightly better food. But still, you dream. Because in a palace built on hierarchy, even the smallest step up feels like triumph. This is the servant world, a kingdom within a kingdom, ruled not by crowns, but by aprons, uniforms, and who gets to sit closest to the fire at night. It is not fair, it is not kind, and it is not glamorous, but it is real, and it shapes your every waking moment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you've left me standing at the bottom rung of YouTube's ladder, seen but never lifted. Be better than a Victorian butler. Subscribe. You've survived the kitchens. You've survived the banquets. But now comes the part of palace life that no one puts in the history books, the bedrooms. The Victorian palace may glitter from the outside, but inside its private rooms, servants dealt with the kind of work that stripped away any illusion of grandeur. You, for example, are now carrying a sloshing chamber pot down a long corridor, praying you don't spill any of its contents on your shoes. Because yes, the queen might wear diamonds, but she still needed someone to empty her pot. That someone is you. And you don't just empty one. Every bedroom, every guest room, every dressing chamber has its own porcelain pot tucked discreetly under a chair or bed. In the morning, you collect them all. Heavy, awkward, some with cracked rims, some with unpleasant surprises left overnight. You carry them in both hands, shoulders hunched, trying not to breathe too deeply. The smell follows you like a shadow, sour and unavoidable. There's no polite word for it. It's waste, and it's your duty. Congratulations. You're basically Victorian indoor plumbing. Now let's talk about bath water. In an era before running taps, every bath had to be prepared by hand. That meant hauling endless buckets of water from the scullery, heating it in great copper pans over a fire, then lugging it up staircase after staircase, bucket after bucket, step after step, until the tub was finally full. Your arms ache, your knees wobble, your back screams in protest. And just when you've filled it, just when the water is finally warm enough, the bather steps in, soaks for 5 minutes, and then demands it all be emptied again. You carry bath water up endless stairs, only to dump it down again after 5 minutes. That's the job. The baths themselves were hardly luxurious by modern standards. A tin tub, perhaps a porcelain one for the wealthy, often dragged into a bedroom and lined with a screen for modesty. Soap was harsh, often made from animal fat, and it left your hands raw. Hot water cooled quickly, so you had to keep hauling in fresh buckets to top it up. And if the bath was for a royal, it had to be just right. Not too hot, not too cold. Heaven help you if they dipped a toe in and frowned. And of course, once the bath was over, you had to haul it all away again. Bucket after bucket, poured down drains, sloshed into gutters, or simply dumped in the yard. The cycle never ended. Water up, water down. You, the human pipeline of the palace. Chamber pots and baths weren't just chores. They were rituals of hierarchy. To carry away someone's waste was a daily reminder of your station. To draw someone else's bath was to surrender your own comfort for theirs. You weren't just scrubbing floors. You were scrubbing away their inconvenience. It's worth remembering that some of the most trusted servants held the most undignified duties. The valet who assisted a gentleman with his shaving, the lady's maid who arranged hairpins and corsets, the necessary women who emptied pots. All were close to their employers in ways that were intimate, sometimes awkward, always invisible. These were jobs of proximity, and with them came a strange mix of contempt and dependence. For you, though, it's just exhaustion. You haul water, you scrub tubs, you carry waste. You wipe spills from polished chamber pots before they're returned to their places. You replace towels, beat dust from mattresses, shake out bedclothes, and smooth every wrinkle from the sheets. The bedrooms must always look pristine, as though no one had ever slept, sweated, or snored in them. And yet, you know the truth. You've carried the waste. You've scrubbed the sweat-stained sheets. You've hauled the water that cooled too quickly. Behind every elegant bedroom lies the stink of labor. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That the royals could command armies, shape empires, and bend nations to their will, but they still needed you to carry away what they left behind at night. Power has its limits, and somewhere in the palace, a chambermaid with a slop bucket proves it every morning. So here you are, bent under the weight of water, nose wrinkling at chamber pots, back sore from bending over beds. Nobody applauds you. Nobody thanks you. But without you, the palace stinks, and the royals stew in their own filth. This is your life, in the bedrooms of a Victorian palace. Not velvet pillows and embroidered sheets, but sweat, soap, and slop buckets. And tomorrow morning, you'll do it all over again. Shh. The palace might be bustling below, but here in the nursery wings, everything is quiet. Or at least, it's supposed to be. This is where the royal children are raised, and where servants shoulder responsibilities that could change the very course of history. Forget the image of queens rocking their babies to sleep. That's your job now, or the job of someone like you. In the Victorian palace, childcare was almost entirely outsourced. Wet nurses, governesses, and nannies filled the nurseries, ensuring the royal infants survived long enough to inherit empires. Start with the wet nurse. If you were chosen for this role, congratulations. You've just signed up to be both indispensable and invisible. Your body is no longer yours. It belongs to the crown. You feed the royal infant with your own milk, often having left your own baby behind in some village. You are scrutinized for your health, your morals, your cleanliness. One sniff of illness, one hint of scandal, and you're dismissed. And here's the pressure. The future of the monarchy literally hangs on your ability to burp an infant. No pressure. Now imagine it from the inside. You cradle a swaddled bundle in your arms, the silk of its blanket brushing your coarse apron. The baby's cries echo through the long corridors, shrill enough to summon a houseful of nurses. You rock gently, humming a lullaby you'll never be remembered for. The child will grow into a king, a queen, or perhaps a footnote in history. You'll fade without a trace. The nursery itself is both cozy and suffocating. Fires burn low to keep the rooms warm, the air faintly scented with milk and lavender. Toys, wooden blocks, dolls, rattles scatter the floor, but you know better than to leave them untidy. Every detail of the royal child's environment is carefully managed, inspected by governesses, judged by visitors, noted in diaries. The nursery is not just a place to raise children. It's a stage where the health and morality of the dynasty are displayed. Then there's the governess. She is a figure of authority, a strict guardian who manages lessons in manners, religion, and academics. Imagine yourself as a royal child, your day scheduled to the minute, your movements watched, your behavior corrected with a sharp word or a sharper glance. And who delivers all this discipline? Not your mother, not your father, but the governess, hired help, shaping the monarch of tomorrow. And don't forget the nanny, the constant shadow of the nursery. She ties ribbons, brushes hair, scrubs knees, and kisses bruises. She is warmth where the governess is strictness, presence where the queen is absent. The children often form deeper bonds with their nannies than with their parents, because it is the nannies who tuck them in at night and wake them in the morning. The crown might belong to their parents, but the daily care belongs to you. And you are never allowed to forget the stakes. A sickly child reflects badly on the entire staff. A tantrum at dinner means someone failed in discipline. Every cough, every rash, every sleepless night becomes a matter of duty. If the child thrives, the parents smile. If the child falters, the blame lands squarely on your shoulders. The absurdity of it all? Upstairs, the royals parade themselves as models of family life. They present their children as symbols of dynastic strength. But the truth is, those children spend more time in your arms than in their parents. You're the one feeding them, washing them, teaching them how to walk. You are the ghost behind the throne, the hands that raised the crown before it ever touched a royal head. Of course, it's not without perks. Wet nurses and nannies were often paid better than scullery maids or hall boys. Some received rooms in the palace, allowances for clothing, even pensions after years of service. But the cost was steep. You gave up your own children to raise someone else's. You surrendered your time, your body, your identity, all for the sake of a dynasty that would never remember your name. And yet the bonds you formed could be real. Many royal children adored their nannies, wrote to them as adults, and remembered them long after court life swept them away. For some servants, that was enough, a legacy written not in history books, but in the quiet affections of a child who once held your hand. But for you, standing in the dim nursery tonight, there is no sentimentality. The fire smolders low, the baby finally sleeps, and you tiptoe away on aching feet. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. Feed, rock, soothe, teach. Invisible work, monumental consequences. This is the nursery world of the Victorian palace. Silent halls, sleepless nights, and the future of monarchy depending on whether or not you can keep a child from crying. And when the history books write of this prince or that princess, remember, it was you who carried them through their first years. Without you, the dynasty ends in its cradle. The palace may look like a fortress of marble and ceremony, but you know better. You live in its hidden passages, and those passages are filled not only with footsteps, but with whispers. Being a servant in a Victorian palace meant being privy to secrets, more than you ever wanted, more than you ever asked for. You know things that would destroy reputations, but say one word, and you're out. Servants stood closer to the royals than anyone else. You dressed them, bathed them, served their meals, and carried away their waste. You were in their bedrooms, their drawing rooms, their carriages. You saw what visitors were never meant to see. Affairs, illnesses, tempers, tears, all the things the monarchy insisted it didn't have. You saw them daily. Imagine walking silently into a room with fresh linens, only to find a prince in bed with someone who is very much another's wife. You drop your eyes, pretend not to notice, and continue folding sheets as though the scene before you is invisible. Or picture delivering a tray of tea to a duchess whose face is red from an argument. She snaps at you, not because you're at fault, but because you're there, an easy target for her anger. You bow, withdraw, and whisper the story only in the servants' hall, where it becomes one more brick in the wall of secrets below stairs. Some secrets were dangerous. Royals caught illnesses that were never supposed to be spoken of, venereal diseases, breakdowns, fevers hushed up for fear of scandal. And yet, someone had to fetch the doctor in the middle of the night. Someone had to clean the soiled sheets. Someone had to endure the silence afterward. That someone was you. You might be surprised by just how much power that gave you. Knowledge in a palace was currency. A valet who knew his master's gambling debts could use that knowledge to secure a better post. A lady's maid who kept quiet about her mistress's indiscretions might be rewarded with cast-off dresses or even a pension. Silence was valuable. Gossip was fatal. And the irony? You held more secrets than the newspapers ever dared print. Imagine knowing every scandal in the palace but still earning less than a modern fast food worker. That's palace service for you. Your head filled with stories fit for novels, your pocket lined with wages barely fit for bread. The pressure was constant. You had to perfect the art of pretending. Pretend not to hear. Pretend not to see. Pretend not to know. If a royal guest staggered drunkenly through the halls, you looked the other way. If a quarrel broke out behind closed doors, you smoothed the carpets and ignored the broken glass. If someone whispered treason, you whistled softly and dusted the mantel. Discretion wasn't just valued, it was survival. That didn't mean secrets never leaked. Servants sometimes sold their stories to newspapers, often under pseudonyms. A disgruntled footman, a dismissed maid, a valet tired of bowing. They could trade whispers for coin. Scandals occasionally splashed into public view, but more often they stayed locked inside the palace walls, buried under your silence. Think of the contradictions. The palace sold itself as a model of morality, a shining example of family virtue. And yet, you, polishing candlesticks in the corner, knew the truth. Behind the polished image were affairs, illnesses, rivalries, and plenty of pettiness. You didn't live in a storybook. You lived in a soap opera that no one outside was supposed to watch, and the weight of it sat on your shoulders. Every time you bowed, every time you curtsied, you carried knowledge you could never speak aloud. You might spend years watching the rise and fall of tempers, the decline of health, the betrayals, the reconciliations, all while your name was never written anywhere. You were both invisible and indispensable, the silent archivist of the monarchy's private life. And so you learned the great paradox of palace service. Power without power. You knew everything, and you could say nothing. You stood in rooms where history unfolded in whispers, and then you went back to the servants' hall to eat crusts of bread. The palace was a stage, and you were both the stagehand and the audience, watching it all unfold without ever stepping into the spotlight. This was the true burden of service. Not just the aching back, the endless chores, the sleepless nights. It was the silence, the knowledge locked behind your lips, the truths you carried to your grave, unspoken, unacknowledged, forgotten. So when the world above admired the palace as a fortress of dignity, you smiled quietly. You knew it was built on secrets, and you were the one holding the keys. You've worked since before dawn. You've carried coal, lit fires, polished boots, scrubbed floors, hauled water, and served meals you didn't eat. By now, you might be wondering, surely even a servant in a Victorian palace had a moment to breathe. A few precious hours to call their own? Well, sort of. But don't get too excited. Free time for servants was a slippery thing. It existed only in the gaps between labor, gaps so small they barely counted as time at all. If you were exceptionally lucky, you might snatch a few minutes after the royals had gone to bed, when the bells finally fell silent. But even then, your body ached too much to enjoy it. Imagine yourself creeping into the servants' hall, collapsing onto a wooden bench, and stretching your legs for the first time all day. The fire in the grate burns low, the room smells of damp wool and coal dust, and your fellow servants sit hunched, half asleep, their hands still red from scrubbing. You talk quietly, if you talk at all, because voices carry, and the last thing you need is another order. What could you do in those few moments? Not much. A bit of mending, perhaps. Servants were expected to repair their own clothes, so your leisure might mean darning a sock or patching a hole in your apron. Romantic, isn't it? If you wanted to read, the choices were limited. The Bible was acceptable. A prayer book was tolerated. But novels? Forget it. Too much imagination, they said, led to discontent. A young maid caught reading Austen or Dickens risked being scolded, or worse, dismissed. After all, if servants filled their heads with stories of love and adventure, they might start to believe they deserved those things themselves. And we couldn't have that, could we? So you sneak 5 minutes with a candle to yourself, tracing words on a page by the flicker of flame, eyes straining against the dark. For just a moment, you forget the chamber pots and the coal dust. You live in another world. And then the bell rings. Of course it does. Leisure wasn't just scarce, it was tightly policed. Servants weren't supposed to linger, weren't supposed to gossip too much, weren't supposed to waste time. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, they said. As though hauling buckets and scrubbing linens all day left any chance for idleness. Still, the expectation hung over you like a shadow. Every moment not spent working had to look useful. If you were caught sitting too long, someone would find you something to do. And even when you did have a rare free afternoon, it wasn't really free. You might be permitted a short walk outside the palace grounds, but only under strict conditions. No wandering too far, no loitering in taverns, no mingling with suspicious characters. You were meant to carry your invisibility with you, even into the world beyond the palace walls. Occasionally, there were scraps of joy. A stolen laugh in the servants' hall, a game of cards played in whispers, a song hummed while polishing brass, if no one was listening. On rare feast days or royal celebrations, servants might be allowed a bit more time, perhaps even a small party of their own. But these moments were exceptions, not rules. They glittered like stars in an otherwise endless night of labor. Think of the cruel paradox. You lived in a palace bursting with luxury, ballrooms, gardens, libraries, and yet none of it was yours to enjoy. You weren't invited to dance beneath the chandeliers. You weren't strolling leisurely through manicured gardens. You weren't leafing through leather-bound volumes in the royal library. You scrubbed those places clean, only to leave them behind for others to enjoy. Your free time happened in the corners, dim, cramped, and fleeting. And here's the grumpy truth. The palace didn't want you rested. It wanted you available. The less you thought of yourself as a human being with needs, the more useful you were. Free time was a dangerous idea because it reminded you that you had a self beyond your work. Better to keep you tired, busy, obedient. better to remind you that even leisure was borrowed, never truly yours. So what did you do with it? You slept. You collapsed into a narrow cot in a cold attic room, pulled a thin blanket over your aching body, and drifted into restless dreams. And then, before you knew it, 5 a.m. arrived again. The bell rang, and your free time dissolved into smoke. This was life for a servant in a Victorian palace. Work without end, leisure without meaning. A lifetime of giving, with barely a minute kept for yourself. And yet, for all its cruelty, you endured it. Because what else was there? For the poor, the orphaned, the desperate, the palace offered food, wages, and shelter at the price of your freedom. So, no, free time didn't really exist. Not in any way that mattered. It was rationed out in crumbs, snatched like contraband, and stolen back by the next clang of a bell. You might think tomorrow will be different, that somehow you'll find an hour, maybe even 2, to yourself. But don't fool yourself. Tomorrow the palace will still need its fires lit, its floors scrubbed, its tables laid, and you will still be there, candle snuffed out, apron tied, ready to run at the sound of the next command. You've spent the entire day running up and down staircases, hauling coal, scrubbing linen, serving banquets, and vanishing whenever the bells demanded. Finally, at long last, the palace has fallen quiet. The royals are tucked into feather beds, dreaming under velvet canopies. And you? You climb one more staircase, this time not to serve, but to collapse. Welcome to the servants' quarters. Don't picture comfort. These rooms were not designed for rest. They were designed for containment. Cramped, cold, and bare, they were tucked into the attics or buried in the basements, far from the gilded chambers above. You push open the door to your dormitory, and the smell greets you before anything else. Damp. Always damp. The walls sweat in winter. The air hangs heavy in summer. The straw in your mattress is musty, flattened from years of bodies before yours. Rats scurry in the corners, bold as you please. The faint scratching keeps you company through the night. If you squint, it's just like a luxury inn. If the luxury inn charged you your dignity as payment. The room is shared, of course. Privacy is for the rich. You sleep side by side with other servants, packed into rows of iron-framed beds or straw pallets. Snores, coughs, the shifting of bodies. This is the lullaby of palace service. If one person tosses, the whole room stirs. If one person wakes early, you all wake early. And if one person dares light a candle after hours to sneak in a bit of reading, well, good luck hiding that from the housekeeper. There are no velvet curtains here, no carpets underfoot. The floorboards creak, the plaster cracks, and the drafts cut through the windows as if the glass weren't even there. In winter, you huddle under thin blankets, breath misting in the air. In summer, the heat rises from the kitchens below until you feel like you're sleeping in a chimney. Your possessions fit into a box at the foot of your bed, if you're lucky enough to have one. A comb, a pair of stockings, maybe a worn prayer book. Some servants kept little keepsakes. A letter from home, a scrap of ribbon, a locket with no chain. These small tokens of selfhood had to be hidden away, because the palace didn't want you to have an identity beyond service. Washrooms? Sparse and shared. Water had to be carried, basins passed from one servant to another. Towels were coarse, soap harsh. Hygiene was a duty, not a comfort. And yet, compared to the poorest laborers in the city slums, your quarters were almost luxurious. Almost. At least you had a roof. At least the rats were somewhat predictable. The social order extended even here. Senior staff might have small private rooms with a proper bed and a writing desk. The butler or housekeeper might even have a fireplace, their quarters a world apart from yours. But for the rest, you learn to live shoulder to shoulder, cheek by jowl, in an endless compromise between exhaustion and endurance. Think of the absurdity. You lived in a palace, surrounded by gold and marble, and yet your own bed was little better than a pauper's. Upstairs, the queen reclined on silken pillows. Downstairs, you stuffed rags into the cracks of your window to stop the wind howling through. And yet, in a strange way, these cramped quarters held their own kind of community. Laughter whispered under blankets, secrets shared in the dark, stories told when exhaustion gave way to stubborn companionship. You might have been invisible upstairs, but here, at least, you were seen. Still, it wasn't a life to envy. The noise, the smell, the cold, the lack of space. It wore you down as surely as the work did. Your body ached from the day. Your mind longed for quiet, but rest never came easily. Dreams were shallow, interrupted by bells, footsteps, or the gnawing in your stomach. And so, you slept in the cracks between duties, curled on a straw mattress that prickled your skin, while rats rustled in the corners and the wind whistled through the glass. The palace glittered above you, but you lived in its shadows, pressed into corners, always waiting for morning to drag you back into the cycle again. This was the truth of the servants' quarters. Not grand, not noble, not dignified, just cramped, cold, and necessary. You were there to rest, not to live. Your life belonged to the palace, even in sleep. So close your eyes now. Pretend the damp is just a cool breeze. Pretend the scratching is just the creak of timbers. Pretend this straw is a feather bed, and this thin blanket is velvet. Pretend, just for a moment, that this is comfort. Because tomorrow at 5 a.m., the bells will ring again, and your luxury inn will vanish like the dream it never was. And if you haven't subscribed, you're treating this channel the same way the palace treated its servants, using the work, then forgetting it in the dark. Don't repeat history. Subscribe. Not all palace service was endless drudgery. Some servants clung to a faint shimmer of hope that a life spent scrubbing, hauling, and bowing might eventually lead to something more. Social mobility in a Victorian palace was rare, but it did exist. Not often, not easily, but just enough to keep people dreaming. Take the story of William Fortnum, for example. Once upon a time, he was just another palace servant, charged with the glamorous job of cleaning out wax stubs from candles at St. James's Palace. Royals liked their candles fresh, and William realized he could pocket the half-burned ends and sell them on the side. It wasn't much, but it was something. That little side hustle grew into a shop, and eventually into Fortnum Mason, one of the most famous luxury grocers in London. From chamber candles to hampers for the aristocracy. Now that's what you call upward mobility. But don't get your hopes up. William Fortnum was the exception, not the rule. For most, palace service wasn't a ladder. It was a treadmill. Your great-grandfather emptied bedpans. Your father emptied bedpans. And now, congratulations. You've inherited the Chamberpot dynasty. Family service was not only common, it was expected. Entire generations gave their lives to the palace, their surnames echoing in dusty staff records while their individuality disappeared. Imagine being born into this system. Your father was a footman, your mother a laundress. From the time you could walk, you were trained for service. You learned how to polish, how to curtsy, how to stand silently with your hands folded. There was no question of becoming a lawyer, a doctor, or even a shopkeeper. Your destiny was already tied to the palace corridors. Service wasn't a career, it was a family tradition. This dynasty of servitude stretched back decades. Some families proudly boasted of their palace connections. "My grandfather carried soup to the king," they'd say. To outsiders, it sounded prestigious. But you, standing with sore feet and an empty stomach, knew the truth. Your family tree was just another extension of the bellboard. Still, ambition flickered. There were rare chances to rise through the ranks. A hall boy might one day become a footman. A clever scullery maid might become assistant cook. A valet with discretion could win favor and travel abroad with his master. These were small promotions, but in a world where every rung of the ladder was steep, they mattered. Each step up meant slightly better pay, slightly better food, maybe even a slightly warmer bed. And proximity to power could sometimes open strange doors. Ladies' maids occasionally received cast-off dresses from their mistresses, silks and lace they could never afford on their own. Some valets inherited personal trinkets when their masters died, and a very few servants married well, catching the attention of clerks, tradesmen, or even minor gentry who visited the palace. Service didn't guarantee poverty forever, but for most, it didn't guarantee escape either. There's a cruel irony here. The palace advertised itself as a place of opportunity, where loyalty was rewarded. And yes, loyalty might earn you a medal, a pension, or a pat on the head from someone too rich to remember your name. But for every Fortnum who built an empire, there were thousands who worked themselves into the grave with nothing more than calloused hands to show for it. And the dynasties of servitude didn't just serve the palace, they were bound to it. Once your family was in, it was hard to get out. Sons replaced fathers, daughters replaced mothers. Service was steady employment, safer than factory work, more reliable than farm labor. So families stayed, generation after generation, trading freedom for stability, individuality for a place in the machine. What did it mean for you? It meant waking up knowing your path was already carved. You weren't free to dream of opening a shop or writing a book or sailing across oceans. You were destined to scrub the same floors your father scrubbed, answer the same bells your mother answered, and collapse on the same straw mattress where your grandparents once slept. And yet, people endured. Because service offered something the outside world rarely did: security. In an age when slums festered with disease, when factories chewed up workers and spat them out crippled, the palace at least provided meals, uniforms, and shelter. Grim shelter, yes, but shelter nonetheless. For some families, this was better than freedom. Better to inherit a chamber pot than starve in the gutter. Still, imagine the weight of it. Knowing your last name in the palace registers meant you were bound to the lowest rungs of history. Generations of your family lived and died so that the monarch could sit a little more comfortably, dine a little more lavishly, dress a little more splendidly. Your dynasty wasn't crowned in gold, it was crowned in starch and sweat. And the bitter truth? History remembers the Fortnums, the exceptions who escaped. It doesn't remember the thousands of unnamed families who served for centuries, their identities swallowed by palace walls. Your family might spend 4 generations carrying trays, but the record will barely mention it. At best, your name is a footnote in a dusty staff roll wedged between scullery maid and boot boy. So yes, there was social mobility, but it was rare, precarious, and uneven. More often than not, you inherited the apron, the broom, the coal bucket. Your birthright was service, your legacy invisibility. And as you stand here, balancing another chamber pot, it hits you. Your family's contribution to the palace was not in crowns or treaties. It was in polished floors, clean linens, and meals served on time. That was your dynasty. That was your inheritance. Your great-grandfather emptied bedpans. Your father emptied bedpans. And now, here you are. Welcome to the family business. Not every servant in the Victorian palace was born within sight of its spires. Some were brought from abroad, imported like curiosities, paraded like symbols, and then promptly buried in the same drudgery as everyone else. Imagine this. You arrive at the palace, accent thick, skin unfamiliar to the London fog. Your clothes swapped for livery the moment you step inside. Your accent, your face, both exoticized and distrusted. To the royals, you are a novelty. To the other servants, you are competition. To yourself, you are stuck. The palace loved to display diversity when it suited the spectacle. Black trumpeters dressed in elaborate uniforms were stationed in royal parades, their presence a visual flourish to impress visiting dignitaries. Indian attendants, imported through the networks of empire, sometimes served as pages or footmen, their turbans and silks carefully staged to underline Britain's global reach. Turkish or Middle Eastern servants were occasionally employed as attendants, not because the royals desperately needed another pair of hands, but because their presence whispered, "Look how far our power stretches. Congratulations, you're a symbol of diversity. Too bad you're still scrubbing floors. For the royals, you were living decoration. Your presence made the palace look cosmopolitan, worldly, powerful. At a banquet or procession, you were as much a spectacle as the silverware. Guests might whisper about your accent, your unusual features, your colorful uniform, as though you were part of the entertainment. But the glamour ended as soon as the ceremony did. Once the trumpets were silent and the dignitaries gone home, you were back in the same servants' hall, sharing benches, eating scraps, and hauling buckets. The other servants might eye you warily, muttering about favoritism if the royals took a shine to you, or mocking your manner of speech if they didn't. You were caught in a limbo, neither truly elevated nor truly accepted. The irony, of course, is that your duties weren't much different. Whether you were a laundress from Kent or a trumpeter from Africa, you still answered bells, polished boots, carried trays, or emptied pots. The palace loved to point at you as proof of its grandeur, but it never forgot to remind you that you were still a servant. And there was suspicion. Always suspicion. In an age when foreign meant suspect, you were trusted enough to dress a royal, but not trusted enough to walk freely outside without comment. You might find your movements noted, your friendships questioned, your loyalties doubted. The palace wanted your presence, but it never wanted your full personhood. Second-person immersion. Picture yourself walking the corridor in bright livery, the feathers of your hat brushing against low ceilings. Nobles glance, servants whisper, and you feel every eye on you. One moment you're praised as exotic, the next you're dismissed as strange. You never quite belong anywhere, and yet some forged remarkable careers. A few foreign-born servants became trusted attendants, remembered by name in diaries and portraits. Others carved out niches as performers, musicians, or personal aides, whose closeness to royalty gave them unusual prominence. But for each of these rare stories, there were dozens who were forgotten, swallowed into the anonymity of palace life. Your accent, your background, your appearance, they made you visible. But visibility wasn't freedom. It was another cage. You couldn't fade into the wallpaper like the English scullery maids. You couldn't vanish like the hall boys. You were always noticed, always judged, always caught between spectacle and suspicion. Think of the cruel absurdity. The palace used you as proof of its tolerance, its empire, its grandeur, yet you were never treated as equal. You were paraded as a symbol, then sent back to carry water like everyone else. Your life was less about what you did and more about what you represented. And when history remembered you, it was as a detail in someone else's story. The king's black trumpeter, the queen's Indian page, the exotic servant in the corner of a portrait. Your name? Forgotten. Your labor? Erased. Your individuality? Never recorded. This was the paradox of being a foreign servant in the Victorian palace. You were both more visible and more invisible than anyone else. More noticed, more whispered about, more exoticized, and yet less remembered, less respected, less free. So you walk the palace halls with your tray, or your trumpet, or your livery, carrying the weight of empire on your shoulders without ever holding its power. You bow, you serve, you vanish. You are both proof of Britain's reach and a prisoner of its hierarchy. And at the end of the day, when you climb back to your cramped quarters, the glamour fades entirely. You lay down on the same straw mattress as everyone else, listen to the same rats scurrying, and dream of home, a home you may never see again. Because here, in the Victorian palace, your identity is not yours, it's theirs. By now, you've seen nearly every corner of palace life. The kitchens, the laundry, the nurseries, the banquet halls, and the bedchambers. You've hauled coal, lit fires, polished boots, emptied chamber pots, and carried trays stacked with food you'd never taste. What ties it all together? One simple truth. The palace was not just a home, it was a machine. And you were one of its gears. Think about it. From the moment you rise at 5 a.m. until you collapse into your straw mattress at midnight, every action you take fuels this great machine. Your footsteps echo in corridors like pistons. The bellboard clanging is the ticking of gears. The clatter of plates, the hiss of fires, the snap of starch in a freshly pressed gown. These are the sounds of an engine humming, an engine that powers monarchy itself. Without you, nothing worked. Without you, the fires went out, the tables stayed bare, the clothes went unwashed. Without you, the illusion of grandeur crumbled. The queen might wear jewels, but what good are jewels if the gown beneath them is wrinkled? The king might host a banquet, but what is a banquet without food carried silently to the table? The palace projected wealth, order, and majesty, but it was all theater, and you were the stagehands. Second-person immersion. You are the hidden gears. They turn the crown into theater. Without you, the chandeliers go dark. Of course, nobody upstairs thought of it that way. To them, servants were background noise, necessary but unnoticed, essential but invisible. Guests marveled at the chandeliers, never at the boy who trimmed the wicks. They admired the gleaming silver, not the maid who polished until her hands bled. They praised the efficiency of palace life, as though it were magic, rather than an army of human beings breaking themselves to keep the illusion alive. And what a strange illusion it was. Monarchs were supposed to embody stability, order, and control, but in truth, they were fragile creatures, propped up by your labor. Their power depended on the machine beneath them. If you stopped turning, even for a day, the monarchy's image cracked. The palace without servants was not a palace at all. It was just a big, cold building filled with dust. The machine never rested. When one part slowed, another sped up. The scullery maid collapsed. Another took her place. A footman fell ill. His shoes were filled by someone else before the banquet began. The palace consumed lives the way a furnace consumes coal, and it never ran out of fuel. There were always more desperate hands willing to join, always more families eager to trade freedom for stability. And yet, for all the hardship, the system worked. Meals appeared on time. Fires burned steadily. Guests were served, beds made, children raised, linens laundered. The monarchy glittered, and the world admired. That was the purpose of the machine, to make power look effortless, to make ceremony look eternal, to convince everyone watching that crowns ruled themselves. But you knew the truth. You knew that behind the sparkle was sweat. Behind the order was exhaustion. Behind the dignity was drudgery. You knew, because you were the one feeding the machine. There's a bitter kind of poetry to it. History remembers the crown jewels. It forgets the people who polished them. The official records tell of kings and queens, ministers and generals. They don't tell of the laundress who worked herself to death in steam. They don't tell of the hall boy who froze in a drafty attic room. They don't tell of you, your hands raw from coal dust, your back bent from carrying water, your ears ringing from the bells. The palace ran on your silence, your invisibility, your endless work. And so, as you stand in these corridors tonight, think of yourself not as a servant, but as a cog in history's great wheel. Without you, the crown doesn't shine. Without you, the throne doesn't stand. Without you, the illusion fails. The palace was a machine. You were its gears. And like all gears, you turned endlessly until you wore down, were replaced, and were forgotten. But while you turned, the monarchy turned with you. Your body is heavy now. The fires are out. The bells are silent. The palace finally sleeps. No footsteps, no orders, no work. Just rest. You've walked the corridors, carried the buckets, polished the boots, and scrubbed the chamber pots. You've climbed into the cramped attic dormitory, laid your head on straw, and listened to the rats scratching in the dark. You've seen the kitchens blaze, the laundry steam, the nurseries hush, and the banquets glitter. You've been the hidden gears of the great machine, silent, unseen, but always turning. But not now. Now, the machine has gone quiet. No clang of the bellboard, no rattle of coal, no footsteps on cold stone, only stillness. Only the rhythm of your own breath. Rest. You are not invisible here. You're not forgotten here. Tonight you've been remembered, spoken of, brought out from the shadows of history. And yet if you're listening without subscribing, you're treating yourself exactly the way history treated these servants, useful in the moment, but forgotten as soon as the lights go out. Don't fade into history like the nameless workers of the palace. Subscribe. It's your one act of rebellion against being erased. And as you drift off tonight, remember you can take these stories with you ad-free, anytime. My first collection, Victorian Madness, Volume 1, is available now, complete with a bonus insider story you won't hear on YouTube. Only a handful of copies are released at this time, and the link is waiting in both the description and the pinned comment. So as your eyes grow heavy, let the palace fade away. The halls are quiet. The bells are still. The machine sleeps, and so can you. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we'll open another dusty door of history. And if you've subscribed, know this. You're not just listening. You're helping me keep these stories alive. You're supporting what I do, and that matters more than you think.